November 14th, 1873, Judith Basin, Montana Territory. The temperature had been falling since before dawn, and by the time Eleanor Marsh walked to the edge of the property line, it had dropped to 23 degrees Fahrenheit with no intention of stopping. The sun was still up, pale and distant, offering light without warmth, the way certain people offered words without meaning. She stood there with everything she owned gathered into a single flour sack, and she watched Gerald Marsh measure the boundary of what used to be her home. He was not looking at her. That was the first thing she noticed. He moved the measuring tape slowly, deliberately pressing each stake into the frozen ground with the careful attention of a man who wanted witnesses to his patience. Two of those witnesses stood near the fence post, neighbors from the claim to the Eastmen who had been invited specifically for this moment. Gerald had planned it that way. He always planned things. She had known this was coming for 3 months. Not suspected. Known. Gerald crouched over a stake and drove it down with a mallet, and the sound rang out across the empty field like a judge's gavel. Only then did he look up at her. His expression was not angry. It was something more deliberate than anger. It was the face of a man who had already won and was simply completing the paperwork. "The sheriff in Fort Benton has a copy of the complaint, Eleanor," he said. His voice was level, almost conversational. "If you're not off this claim by sundown, I file it formally." Eleanor looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she asked the only question that actually mattered. "Does Clara know you're doing this?" Gerald stopped. The mallet hung in his hand. 1 second passed, then 2. It was not a long pause, but it was long enough. A man with nothing to hide does not pause before answering that question. Then he turned back to the stake and kept measuring. She looked toward the house. Clara stood in the doorway, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her eyes fixed on some middle distance between herself and her sister. Not looking at the confrontation. Not looking away from it either. Just standing in that narrow space of deliberate not seeing that Eleanor recognized as a decision disguised as inaction. Clara was 3 years older. She had taught Eleanor to braid her hair, to read English, before they learned it in school, to tell the difference between a sky that was simply overcast and a sky that meant real trouble. She had survived the crossing from Poland in 1866, survived the first terrible winter in Pennsylvania, survived a marriage to a man who turned out to be harder than anyone had expected. Clara had survived many things by choosing not to see them clearly. This was one more. Eleanor opened her flour sack and took out a folded piece of paper. She had written it 3 weeks ago in the evenings when Gerald was in town and Clara was asleep. She walked to the fence post nearest to Gerald and set the paper on top of it, weighting it down with a small, flat stone so the wind would not take it. Gerald glanced at it but did not pick it up. She turned and walked west without looking back. She did not hear Gerald's footsteps. She did not hear Clara call out. What she heard after a few minutes was the sound of Gerald picking up the paper from the fence post, the small scrape of it lifting off the wood. She had been listening for that. He kept it. She had counted on that too. The paper was a list. 18 months of work recorded in the precise handwriting she had learned from a school teacher in Krakow before the failed uprising of 1863 sent her family across the Atlantic. Every date, every task. The cabin walls she had built because Thomas had no patience for carpentry. The furniture she had made from scrap lumber because Thomas believed buying things was a form of optimism. The fence she had repaired 3 times the garden she had planted and harvested, twice the root cellar she had dug alone during a week when Thomas was checking trap lines and Gerald was in Helena. She had recorded the time each task took, and beside each entry, she had written the going wage for that work in Montana Territory. The total came to $410. Gerald's claim against her, which she would not learn the full details of until weeks later, was for $40. She had written the list because she believed in documentation the way some people believe in prayer. Evidence was evidence. A number written down in ink on paper was harder to argue with than a memory, and Eleanor Marsh had learned early that the people with the loudest voices were not always the people with the longest memories. She had kept the original and made a copy. The copy was in the flour sack, folded small, tucked beneath the extra dress. She walked west. 3 miles is not a long distance under ordinary circumstances. In November in Montana Territory, carrying everything you own with the temperature at 23 degrees and dropping 3 miles is a negotiation. Eleanor did not think about Clara as she walked. She thought about the contents of her sack with the systematic attention of a woman taking inventory. The small knife that had belonged to Thomas, which he had carried on every trap line and never learned to sharpen properly. She had resharpened it 4 times in 6 years, and it had outlasted him. The coil of rope she had braided herself from strips of old harness leather and dried grass fiber, a skill she had learned from her grandmother during a winter when rope cost more than anyone in their village could afford to pay. The wedding ring still on her finger, which Gerald could not touch legally, being personal property and not part of any claim. And the folded piece of newspaper at the bottom of the sack, on the back of which she had drawn in pencil a rough map of the sandstone formations she had seen in April during a water haul. She had seen them and noted them the way a careful person notes a fire exit, not because she expected to need it, because knowing where it was cost nothing and might someday be worth everything. The formations were 3 miles west. Cliff faces honeycombed with wind-carved alcoves, some shallow as a sleeping dog's bed, others cutting back 30 feet or more into the rock. She had stood at a distance in April and looked at them the way her grandfather had taught her to look at landscape, not for what it was, but for what it could do. Her grandfather had been a shepherd in the Carpathian foothills, a practical man who believed that the land already contained most of the solutions a person needed if they paid close enough attention. He had taken her into a cave shelter when she was 8 years old during a storm that kept them there for 2 nights, and he had explained in the matter-of-fact tone he used for everything the earth holds temperature steady when the air goes wild. The rock does not care what the wind is doing. The rock has been here since before anyone was keeping records, and it will be here after everyone stops. She had been 8 years old, and she had believed him completely. 40 years of living had not given her any reason to stop. She reached the formations at dusk. She moved from alcove to alcove, pressing her palm against the interior walls, measuring depth by pacing, testing the floor slope with her feet. She found it on the fourth try, a chamber roughly 12 feet wide, 22 feet deep, ceiling height, dropping from 7 feet at the entrance to 5 feet at the back. The floor sloped upward toward the rear. She stood at the entrance and looked in and felt the still air against her face. 47 degrees. She could feel it even without a thermometer. She had enough years in cold country to read temperature through her skin the way a musician reads a room through sound. Outside, the air was already below 20. By midnight, it would be closer to 15. She set her flour sack down against the rear wall at the highest point of the sloping floor. Warm air rises. Cold air settles at the low points near the entrance, pooling like water in the lowest available space. She would sleep where the air was warmest at the back, and up wrapped in both dresses she owned with the flour sack under her head. She had slept in worse arrangements during the crossing from Europe, in a bunk so narrow that rolling over required planning. This was better than that. She listened to coyotes working the draws below as the last light left the sky, and she thought about the list. $410 against 40. The arithmetic of her situation was not complicated. What was complicated was the question of what to do next, and she found, sitting in the dark, with her back against cool sandstone, that the answer was already assembling itself from things she already knew. She would stay. Not because she had no other choice, though. Fort Benton was 67 miles north, and winter was already painting the Highwood Mountains white. She would stay because this was not desperation. This was a decision, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered enormously to her. She had been making decisions since she was old enough to make them. This was one more. She spent the next 4 days finding material. The work was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Deadfall cottonwood from the creek bottom, each piece carried 3 miles uphill. An abandoned line shack from the railroad survey of 1871, its walls already half collapsed into the sage, which yielded 10 boards before the whole structure finally gave up and flattened. 6 feet of rusted chain, 3 bent nails, a cracked shovel blade that would still hold an edge if she was careful. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had stopped performing effort for an audience. There was no one watching. The work was the work, and when one piece was done, the next piece began. On the afternoon of the third day, she was hauling a section of cottonwood up the last slope toward the formations when she heard a wagon on the Carroll Trail below. She did not stop working. The wagon slowed. The man on the seat was Robert Finch, a small merchant from the settlement at Utica, 12 miles east. She had seen him twice before, once when she bought flour, once when she sold 2 rabbit pelts. He had the look of a man who was fundamentally decent, but had never been tested in any way that required him to discover this about himself. He climbed down from the wagon and took the other end of her cottonwood log without being asked. They carried it the last 100 yards together before he spoke. Mrs. Marsh, he said, setting his end down carefully. My wife Margaret has arranged a room at the Hensley boarding house in Utica. It's not charity. You'd work for your keep. Eleanor looked at him. He meant it genuinely. That was the most difficult kind of offer to refuse because refusing it required explaining something that was hard to explain to someone who had never needed to. Is the room mine, Mr. Finch? She asked. Or is it the Hensley family's? Finch opened his mouth and then closed it again. He was working through the question she could see and finding that it led somewhere he had not expected. You'd have use of it, he said finally. That's a different thing from owning it, she said. Thank you for the offer. Give my regards to your wife. She picked up her cottonwood and continued up the slope. She did not tell him about the fourth day when she stopped a freight hauler on the trail and traded her wedding ring for a handsaw with 7 broken teeth, a hammer missing half its handle, and a tarpaulin that had more holes than solid fabric. The hauler had looked at her with the specific expression of a man who wants to say something and cannot find the right words. Winter's coming hard, ma'am, he said finally. That ring could have bought you passage to Helena. She looked at him. Helena means starting over with nothing, she said. I'm not starting over. She put the ring in his hand and picked up the tools. She had just started back toward the formations when she heard horses coming from the direction of Utica. 2 of them. She recognized Margaret Sutton before the woman dismounted because Margaret Sutton was the kind of person who looked the same from 100 yards as from 10 feet, composed, deliberate, and certain that the world was arranged approximately the way she preferred it. The woman riding beside her was older, smaller, and harder to read. Eleanor did not know her. Margaret dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who had spent considerable time in the saddle and still managed to make it look like a drawing room entrance. She was perhaps 45, well-dressed for the territory, with the particular expression of a woman who had thought carefully about what she was going to say and was prepared for several possible responses. Mrs. Marsh, she said, I'm glad we caught you. This is Mrs. Aldrich. She's been in this territory since 1865. Eleanor waited. A woman alone in this wilderness reflects on all of us, Margaret continued. Her voice carried the slightly elevated register of someone making an argument they have rehearsed. What will people think when they hear we allowed this to happen? There are resources available. There are people who want to help. It seems to me that accepting help gracefully is... Tell them I chose it, Mrs. Sutton, Eleanor said. That should settle the reflection. Margaret's expression shifted very slightly. It was not anger exactly. It was the expression of someone who had prepared for several responses and had not prepared for that one. The older woman, Mrs. Aldrich, had not spoken. She was looking past Eleanor toward the rock formations, studying them with the focused attention of someone who had spent a long time learning to see landscape clearly. Eleanor watched her. Show me what you're building. Child, Mrs. Aldrich said. It was not a question. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then turned and led her toward the formations. She heard Margaret Sutton make a small sound behind them. She did not turn around. She showed Mrs. Aldrich the cave, the depth, the ceiling height, the sloping floor. She showed her the thermal principle, the way the sandstone formation, 40 feet thick above them, absorbed and held the Earth's constant temperature, regardless of what the air was doing on the surface. She explained the fire pit design she was planning, the 2-wall system for the entrance, the chimney that would draw air low and vent exhaust high. She spoke plainly in the way she spoke about everything, without apology and without performance. Mrs. Aldrich listened without interrupting. She placed her palm against the interior wall, held it there for 10 seconds. She looked at the sloping floor in the high rear section where Eleanor's flour sack sat against the wall. She did not say the thing that most people would have said. She did not say it was impressive or ingenious or brave. She simply nodded once with the nod of someone who recognizes something they already understand. The water situation, she asked. Snow melt in winter, Eleanor said. The creek is a half-mile down in good weather. Mrs. Aldrich nodded again. Watch the chimney draft in hard wind, she said. Smoke can back up if the pressure differential collapses. Keep the intake low and wide. Then she turned and walked back toward the horses. Margaret Sutton had been standing outside the formation entrance for 20 minutes. She looked when they emerged like a woman who had been composing a speech and was now uncertain whether to deliver it. Eleanor watched her make the decision. When this fails, Mrs. Marsh, Margaret said, don't expect us to be waiting. She rode back toward Utica without looking back. Mrs. Aldrich mounted her horse and then paused, looking down at Eleanor with an expression that was difficult to name precisely. My first winter in this territory, she said. I lived in a dugout with 6 other families for 4 months. 3 of them thought it was beneath them. A pause. The other 3 are still here. She rode east. Eleanor watched them go, then turned back to the rock. By November 28th, she had a front wall across the cave entrance. Vertical cottonwood poles set 18 inches apart, gaps chinked with creek bank clay mixed with dry grass. The whole structure braced by horizontal stringers lashed with strips cut from Thomas's old leather belt. She left a doorway 3 feet wide on the south side and covered it with the tarpaulin weighted with flat stones. Then she built a second interior wall, 8 feet inside the first, creating an air gap between them that would trap heat in the same way a doubled window traps warmth, using the principle of still air as insulation. The fire pit was a problem she had thought about carefully. She dug it 18 inches deep at the cave's mouth, lined it with flat sandstone. She carried up from the creek bed and built a chimney from stacked rock and clay that ran along the ceiling toward the entrance gap. The principle was simple and very old: draw cold air in from outside, and at the low point, heat the stone mass with burning wood, send exhaust along the ceiling and out. The stones would absorb the heat of burning and release it slowly for hours after the fire went cold. One good burn before sleep, and the stones would hold warmth until morning. She had learned this from her grandmother, who had learned it from hers in a chain of practical knowledge that ran back through Polish winters to a time before anyone in her family had owned anything worth recording. She tested it on the first hard night: 8 degrees outside, 44 degrees in the front chamber where the fire pit sat, 51 at the rear sleeping area where her body heat combined with the stone-held warmth and the tarpaulin she had rigged as a low ceiling to create a pocket of trapped air. She lay in the back of the cave and listened to the wind work the draws below and felt nothing of it. Not a draft, not a whisper. The stone was 40 feet thick above her, and it did not care. She had been right. She had known she would be. The knowing felt less like triumph than like a door closing softly on everything that had come before. The settlement at Utica had opinions, and they arrived wearing different faces. Big Tom Calloway came with 2 neighbors and the air of a man who had survived things and therefore knew the limits of what was possible. He was large in the way that some men in hard country are large, as if the territory itself had added weight to him, and he had a reputation for plain speaking that he was justifiably proud of. He looked at the entrance wall, looked at the fire pit, and looked at the chimney run along the ceiling with the expression of a man reviewing evidence. "I found the Peterson family in March of '71, he said. All 4 of them frozen in their dugout when the ventilation plugged with snow. Rock doesn't breathe like wood, Mrs. Marsh. You seal yourself in there with the fire going, the smoke will kill you before the cold does." It was not cruelty. It was the warning of a man who had carried 4 frozen bodies out of a dugout and did not want to carry any more. Eleanor did not argue with him about theory. She gestured for him to follow her inside to the deepest point of the rear chamber. She asked him one question. "Do you smell smoke right now, Mr. Calloway?" He inhaled. He looked up at the ceiling where the chimney run angled toward the entrance. He put his hand near the intake gap at floor level and felt the movement of cold outside air coming in low. He did not answer her question. He stood in the rear chamber for 10 more minutes, touching the walls, watching the candle flame bend toward the chimney draft before he went back outside. His neighbors had not come in. They watched him emerge and waited for his verdict. He gave them nothing. He simply nodded once the way Mrs. Aldrich had nodded and started back toward his horse. Reverend Samuel Holt came 2 days later alone, with the careful expression of a man who had prepared to help someone and was recalibrating as he went. He was younger than Big Tom, newer to the territory, and carried the particular uncertainty of someone whose authority had not yet been tested by real conditions. "A woman living 3 miles from the nearest Christian soul is a temptation for trouble. Mrs. Marsh," he said. He was standing at the entrance, not quite inside, which told her something about his level of commitment to the conversation. "The church has a responsibility, and I feel I should—" Reverend Eleanor said, setting down the tool she had been working with. Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who is being precise because precision matters. "If your concern is my soul, I'm grateful for it. If your concern is appearances, I'd ask you to be honest about that." The color rose in Holt's face. He was not a dishonest man. He simply had not been explicit with himself about which concern had actually brought him 3 miles in the cold, and having it named out loud was uncomfortable. He stood there for a moment, caught between responses, then said, "I'll pray for your safety, Mrs. Marsh." "That's kind," she said. "Come back if you want to talk further." He did not come back that week. She suspected he would eventually. December 8th, the temperature dropped below 0 Fahrenheit before noon and stayed there for 6 days. Eleanor woke each morning in the rear chamber with the air holding steady. At 51 degrees, walked forward to the fire pit, where residual heat in the stones kept the front chamber at 44, and stepped outside into air so cold it turned her breath to ice crystals before the vapor could rise. She did not suffer. That was the thing she had not entirely expected. She had expected to survive. She had not expected the particular quality of those mornings, the silence inside the cave that was not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of something steady. The way the stone held its temperature, the way a reliable person holds their word without drama and without exception. The cold was outside. The cold could stay outside. What she had not prepared for in all her practical calculation was the silence. 20 feet back from the entrance, sound dampened to nothing. She could hear her own heartbeat. On still nights, she could hear wolves in the Highwood Peaks 15 miles distant. The silence was not lonely exactly. It was the silence of something solid, a structure that excluded chaos by its nature, not by effort. But it was also undeniably the silence of one person. One heartbeat, one set of footsteps on the stone floor. She had made her decision, and she held to it without regret. Still on the 7th morning of the cold snap, she stood at the entrance with her coffee cup and looked out at the white-locked landscape and acknowledged privately and without drama that the question of what came next was a real question. She had food for perhaps 2 months if she was careful. She had the tools she had traded for. She had the skills her grandmother taught her and the skills her own hands had built over 41 years of living in cold places and solving problems with what was available. She also had tucked in the flour sack beneath her spare dress, a copy of a list that came to $410. Gerald Marsh would come eventually. She had known that since November. He would come with papers and a lawyer in the particular confidence of a man who had never been challenged by someone who had prepared longer than he had. She was prepared to receive him. But first there was the matter of December and what December was about to bring. Walking up the slope toward her cave in the form of a Swedish homesteader, carrying a sack of potatoes and an expression of confident certainty that was about to meet its first serious obstacle. She watched him come, and something that might have been amusement moved through her chest and settled there like the warmth from her fire pit stones, slow and steady and lasting well into the morning. Owen Bergstrom had said in the saloon at Utica 3 weeks earlier that the cave was proof the woman did not know what she was doing. Daniel Chen had been in that saloon because his father sent him to collect a debt from the barkeep, and Daniel had very good ears and the particular gift of 12-year-old boys for being present in rooms where adults forget to lower their voices. He relayed this information to Eleanor on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, sitting cross-legged on the cave floor, eating a bowl of cornmeal she had heated over the fire pit stones, describing Owen Bergstrom's exact words with the unsentimental accuracy of a child who is reporting facts rather than offering comfort. Eleanor was sharpening the handsaw when Daniel told her this. She kept sharpening. "What else did he say?" she asked. "That a proper cabin with a good stove was the only sensible approach to a Montana winter," Daniel said, "and that anyone who thought otherwise was either inexperienced or not thinking clearly." "And what did Big Tom Calloway say to that?" Daniel considered. "He didn't say anything. He just finished his drink." Eleanor tested the saw blade against her thumb and found it acceptable. "Owen Bergstrom," she said, "built his cabin using railroad ties and clay chinking." Daniel nodded already, having made the same calculation. "Clay cracks when it dries," he said. "It does," Eleanor agreed. She did not say anything else about it. But 3 weeks later, when Owen Bergstrom appeared at the bottom of the slope carrying a sack of potatoes and wearing the expression of a man who was doing someone a considerable favor, she was not surprised. She had been in the way of careful people quietly waiting. Daniel Chen had come into her life the way most useful things did, without announcement and through a side door. The first time he appeared on a gray afternoon in the first week of December, he simply walked up to the cave entrance and looked inside with the frank curiosity of someone who has heard a story and wants to verify it against reality. He was 12 years old, compact and quick-eyed, with the self-possessed bearing of a child who has grown up in circumstances that required him to be more useful than ornamental. His grandfather had worked the California mines in the 1850s, and something of that history had passed down through the family in the form of a practical relationship with difficult terrain. Eleanor did not ask what he wanted. She stepped aside and let him look. He walked the full length of the cave, touching nothing, asking nothing, working it out for himself. He tested the floor slope with his feet. He stood under the chimney run and looked up. He put his hand near the entrance where the cold draft came in low and felt the airflow. Then he turned around and looked at Eleanor. My grandfather lived underground for a summer in Tuolumne, he said. He said it stayed cool when everything outside was burning. Same principle, Eleanor said. Reversed for winter. Daniel nodded. He had understood before she confirmed it. I can carry wood, he said. I know where the good deadfall is down by the second bend. Bigger pieces than what you've been bringing up. She gave him a bowl of cornmeal. He came back the next day with an armful of cottonwood that was considerably better than what she had been finding. He came back the day after that, and the day after that, until coming to the cave became part of his daily pattern, the way certain routes become habitual, not through decision, but through repeated choice. He became her newspaper. Not because she asked him to, but because he understood with the instinctive social intelligence of someone who has always occupied the margins of multiple worlds, that information was a form of currency, and he had access to currency she did not. He told her about the conversation at the Utica Saloon. He told her when Gerald Marsh came through town and asked Robert Finch about the legal status of territorial land that had not been homesteaded. He told her when Reverend Holt reported to Margaret Sutton that the cave dwelling appeared to be in his estimation structurally sound but morally irregular. He told her these things without editorializing, and she received them the same way, adding them to a running account she kept in her head alongside the food inventory and the firewood calculation and the list of things that would need repair come spring. What she gave him in return was the thing he had not known he wanted until she began providing it. She taught him to read not the halting functional literacy he had acquired from his mother, but real reading, the kind that opens text the way a key opens a door. She taught him arithmetic beyond counting, the kind that lets you look at a problem and find the shape of its solution before you began working it. She taught him these things in the back of the cave on winter afternoons while the fire pit stones radiated their stored warmth outward in slow, reliable waves. And she taught him because he was quick and because teaching someone is one of the more efficient ways of not being alone. Owen Bergstrom came on December 19th with potatoes, dried beef, and the particular confidence of a man who has survived 2 Canadian winters and believes this qualifies him to assess most situations. He was perhaps 38 broad through the shoulders, with the careful hands of someone who had learned carpentry properly and the straightforward manner of a person who had never had reason to be indirect. Eleanor had nothing against him. He had said what he believed in the Utica Saloon, which was more honest than most, and he had come here today with actual food, which was more useful than most. She could work with a person like that, or at least around them. He looked at the cave entrance, at the double wall she had built at the chimney outlet above the door, gap with the evaluating eye of a carpenter assessing another carpenter's work. She could see him finding things he would have done differently and things he could not find fault with, and the combination producing in him a kind of recalibration he had not expected to need. I built my cabin solid, Mrs. Marsh, he said finally. It was not quite the opening line he had planned. Something in what he was looking at had adjusted it slightly. You're welcome to stay there while you figure out a better arrangement. Eleanor looked at him. Did you chink the gaps with clay or with mud, Mr. Bergstrom? Clay, he said. There was a half second where something shifted in his face. Not alarm, but the beginning of a realization he was not yet ready to complete. Come back in a week, she said. She took the potatoes and the dried beef and thanked him genuinely because the food was genuinely useful, and she went back to work. He came back in 2 days. Not because a week had passed, because the clay had cracked as it dried the way clay always cracks when it dries against a surface that expands and contracts with temperature changes, and the snowmelt running off his steeply pitched roof had found those cracks and then frozen at the eaves and redirected itself backward through the walls. 3 nights of wet blankets. A stove burning wood so damp it produced more smoke than heat. The inside temperature dropping faster than a good fire could compensate. He stood at the cave entrance with a bundle of wet bedding under one arm and the expression of a man who has been wrong about something significant and is in the process of deciding how to handle that. Eleanor looked at the wet bedding. She stepped aside. Front chamber, she said. Firewood is on the left. 2 hours of splitting tomorrow. He did not say anything about his earlier assessment. She did not say anything about it either. The silence on that subject was, she felt, the appropriate response from both of them. He slept in the front chamber and woke the next morning dry for the first time in 4 days. She watched him notice this, watched him put his hand against the interior wall and feel the stored warmth in the stone, watched him look at the firewood stack bone dry because the cave held its humidity at a constant level that preserved wood the way a good cellar preserves apples. He was adding things up, and he was doing it honestly, which meant the total was going to be uncomfortable. He split firewood for 2 hours with an efficiency that was genuinely impressive. She let him work without commentary. When he finished, he stacked it the way he had seen her stack it, which was not the way he would have done it himself, and that small concession told her more about his character than the 2 hours of labor had. He came back the next night, and the next. On the fourth night, he arrived with lumber in the wagon, real milled boards from Utica, and asked whether she would mind if he improved the door situation. She minded the framing slightly, but the door he built was better than what she had, and she was practical enough to know the difference between ownership and improvement. The problem announced itself quietly the way most serious problems do. It was Robert Finch who said it, first arriving one afternoon to drop off a small order of flour Eleanor had sent money with Daniel to purchase. Owen was in the cave replacing the hinges on the new door with hardware he had brought from his own supply. Finch came in, assessed the scene, and said to no one in particular, "Got yourself quite a setup here." He meant it as a compliment. Owen said without looking up from the hinge plate, "We've been working on it." "We." Finch looked at Eleanor. Eleanor was looking at Owen. Owen finished with the hinge, tested the door twice, and looked up to find both of them watching him with different expressions. Eleanor set down her tool. She spoke without heat, without raising her voice, with the precision of someone who understands that certain things must be stated clearly or they will keep occurring. "It's my cave, Owen," she said. "You've improved it. That's a different thing from owning it." Owen went very still. He looked at the hinge in his hand. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Finch, who suddenly found reason to examine the firewood stack with great attention. "You're right," Owen said. "I'm sorry, it won't happen again." It was a short apology. It was also a complete one. Eleanor recognized the difference between a man who apologizes to end a conversation and a man who apologizes because he understands what he did. Owen Bergstrom was the second kind. He held her gaze when he said it and did not add anything to qualify or soften it, and then he went back to the door hinge with the same focus he had brought to it before. Finch left shortly after. She heard a week later through Daniel that Owen had corrected himself in public. Sitting at the Utica saloon in approximately the same chair where he had made his original assessment of her capabilities 3 weeks earlier, he had told Big Tom Calloway that he had been wrong about the cave, that Mrs. Marsh had built something solid, that he would put his own winter on it. Big Tom, according to Daniel, had not said anything. He had nodded once and ordered another drink. Margaret Sutton came in mid-January, and this time she brought Reverend Holt. It was not a casual visit. Eleanor understood its purpose before they dismounted. Margaret had the particular posture of a person who has constructed an argument carefully and intends to deliver it, and Holt rode beside her with the expression of a man who has agreed to participate in something he is not entirely certain about. They came inside, which was itself a shift. In December, Holt had stood at the entrance. Today he came in, looked around at the improvements Owen had made at Daniel sitting on a stool, doing sums on a piece of birch bark at the organized firewood, and the hung tarpaulin ceiling in the rear chamber. His expression was doing something complicated. Margaret did not look at the cave. She looked at Eleanor. "The community has standards, Mrs. Marsh," she said. "I think you understand what I mean." "Tell me plainly what you mean, Mrs. Sutton." Margaret's chin rose slightly. "An unmarried woman living with an unmarried man 3 miles from the nearest household is an irregular arrangement. It reflects on the community's character. Reverend Holt agrees that some formal acknowledgement of the situation is." Owen had been in the rear chamber. He came forward. Eleanor put her hand briefly on his arm, not roughly but clearly, and he stopped. She looked at Margaret Sutton with the expression of a woman who has been patient for a long time and is still being patient but is being precise about it. "Mr. Bergstrom sleeps in the front chamber," she said. "I sleep in the rear. The rock wall between us is 8 inches thick and has been there since before anyone in this territory was born. I trust its judgment." A pause, the length of a breath. "If yours leads you to a different conclusion, Mrs. Sutton, I'd be interested in what evidence you're working from." Margaret had no answer to that. Not a real one. She pivoted the way people do when one line of argument closes. "When this fails, Mrs. Marsh, I want you to know that we will do what we can." When, not if, Eleanor noted the word. She noted also that Margaret's eyes, just before she turned to leave, moved around the cave with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite something else. something closer to a calculation being revised against its will. Holt did not leave with Margaret. He waited until she had mounted and started down the slope, and then he stood in the cave entrance and looked at Eleanor with an honesty he had not managed on his previous visit. "She's not wrong about the community standards," he said, "but she's not right about you." He paused. "I don't know yet which one matters more." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Let me know when you figure it out, Reverend." He nodded. He looked at Daniel, who was watching the exchange with the transparent interest of a 12-year-old who knows he is witnessing something adults will discuss later. Holt almost smiled. Then he walked out into the January cold. William Drake arrived on a Thursday in late January, riding a railroad survey horse and carrying a leather notebook already half filled with sketches of other people's practical solutions to territorial problems. He was Dutch methodical and refreshingly free of the need to establish his credentials before asking questions. He simply walked into the cave, sat down on the stool Daniel usually occupied, and began drawing. He examined the fire pit system for a long time without speaking. He measured the chimney run with a piece of string. He pressed his palm against the rear wall and held it there while he looked at the ceiling. "Thermal mass storage," he said more to himself than to Eleanor. "You're using the sandstone as a heat battery. The Romans called it the hypocaust principle, though they ran it from below. You've adapted it for gravity-fed ventilation." He looked up at her. "This is brilliant. Simple, but brilliant." "It works," Eleanor said. That was all she needed it to be. Owen was standing near the entrance, listening with the particular attention of a carpenter who has been living in the result of something and is now hearing it explained in a language that gives him new tools for understanding it. Daniel was listening with both ears in the expression of someone filing away information at speed. Drake asked Owen to explain the double wall construction. Owen did accurately, and Eleanor watched him do it without inserting herself because he had earned the right to explain the parts he had built. Drake sketched rapidly, asking clarifying questions, and then looked up at Eleanor. "May I use this design, share it with other homesteaders?" "Knowledge isn't property," she said. "Use it if it helps." Drake opened his notebook to a fresh page. "I'd like to record your name properly, for the record. Eleanor Marsh, Eleanormarsh. Former name?" She looked at him. "Kowalczyk," she said, Kowalczyk. Drake wrote it carefully, then looked up. "Polish." "Yes. My grandmother was from Krakow. She had a saying." His pen moved. "She said Poles either die early or outlive everyone else." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Your grandmother," she said, "was paying attention." Drake smiled, snapped his notebook closed, and said he would send copies of the design to 3 settlements along the Fort Benton route before spring. He was as good as his word. She would learn this later in the particular way you learn things about people who do what they say, through results, not announcement. January 28th began as a manageable day. The temperature had been cold, but not savage, for 2 weeks, hovering around 18 degrees during the daylight hours and dropping to perhaps 5 below at night. Owen had gone to Utica that morning to collect a lumber order he had placed before Christmas, the kind of transaction that should have taken 3 hours and been finished by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, Eleanor was watching the sky. She had seen that color once before in the winter of 1872, in the days before the storm that killed Thomas. Not gray exactly, a yellowish gray like old bone, with a quality of density that meant something was coming from the north that had a long way traveled behind it and considerable intention remaining. The barometric pressure drop was something she read in her joints before she understood she was reading it, a gathering heaviness that the body knows before the mind catches up. By 3 o'clock, it was snowing horizontally. By 4, the visibility had closed to 6 feet. By 5, the temperature had fallen to 11 below and was still dropping at a rate that suggested it had no particular destination in mind. Owen had been due back at noon. Eleanor built the fire pit to maximum capacity, the stones glowing a dull orange by evening. She hung every spare piece of canvas across the entrance, triple-layered, weighted at the bottom with creek stones she had carried up in September, against exactly this kind of need. She set a pot of water to heat on the stones for broth. She did all of this quickly and without wasted motion, the way she did things when the margin for error was narrowing. Then she coiled a length of rope, tied one end to the center post of the entrance wall, and stood in the doorway with the other end in her hand, looking out into white nothing. She listened between gusts for anything that was not wind. She heard nothing for a long time. The temperature outside, by her estimation, had reached 20 below. Wind chill considerably further. The kind of cold that did not announce itself as cold exactly, but rather as an absence, as if warmth had been a color, and someone had simply removed it from the world. At 7 in the evening, she heard the horse before she heard anything else. Not movement precisely, a sound like a large object settling against resistance very near the rock face. She went out with the rope in one hand and the candle lantern in the other, and she found the horse standing pressed against the sandstone formation, with its head down and its sides heaving, too exhausted to do anything but stop. It had walked directly into the rock, because the rock was the first solid thing it had found in however many miles of white blindness. Owen was still in the saddle. His hands were locked around the reins from the inside fingers, frozen into position, the leather wrapped through his grip in a way that suggested he had been holding on with everything he had until everything ran out. His face was covered in a shell of ice, formed by his own exhaled breath, freezing layer by layer over however many hours the storm had been building. He weighed approximately 180 pounds. Eleanor Marsh weighed 122. She got him off the horse by loosening the reins from his grip, finger by finger in the dark, and she got him to the ground without dropping him, by letting him slide against her, rather than fall, taking the weight in increments her body could manage. Then she put the rope around her own waist and dragged him the 30 yards to the cave entrance, 1 foot at a time, stopping twice to rest, moving again each time because stopping was not an option she intended to exercise. The horse she brought in, too. It stood in the front chamber with its sides still heaving, steam rising off its coat into the warmer air, and after a time it stopped trembling and accepted water from the bucket she held up to it. Owen she laid in the rear chamber, away from the direct heat of the fire pit stones. She cut his boots off because the leather had gone rigid as iron, and she found his feet white and waxy to the ankle. Both hands the same. She had seen this before. She knew what not to do as clearly as she knew what to do, and what not to do was apply heat directly, which would rupture the tissue cells as they expanded too quickly and turn survivable frostbite into permanent damage. She soaked cloth in cool water and wrapped his feet and hands. She warmed the water slowly over the next 3 hours, a degree at a time, using her own body temperature to moderate what she poured in. She worked by feel and by the slight changes in his skin color, and by the knowledge she had inherited from a grandmother who had saved a shepherd's frozen hands in a Carpathian winter, 80 years before Eleanor was born, a chain of practical knowledge that had crossed an ocean and arrived exactly where it needed to be. He regained consciousness near midnight. He opened his eyes and looked at the cave ceiling, and then at Eleanor, and the first words he said were not, "Where am I?" or "What happened?" They were, "The horse." "Front chamber," she said, "ate your portion of hay. She's fine." Owen closed his eyes again. The tension went out of him all at once, like a knot releasing, and Eleanor understood in that release something she had not quite put words to yet. A man whose first coherent thought coming back from the edge of death is for the animal that carried him home is a man with a particular set of priorities. She added it to what she already knew about him and found the total was better than she had calculated. Outside, the temperature dropped to 41 below zero. The wind sustained at 45 miles per hour with gusts to 68, the kind of cold that stopped being a weather event and became something closer to a geological fact, a feature of the landscape as fixed as the sandstone above them. Inside the cave, 49 degrees in the rear chamber, the horse standing quiet, Owen sleeping with the deep unconsciousness of a body in serious repair. Eleanor sitting beside him with her hands still warm from the water, listening to the storm do its worst against 40 feet of rock that did not notice. She was not alone. That was the thing she sat with through the long hours before dawn, the thing she turned over carefully and examined from several sides the way she examined anything she was not sure how to classify. She had been alone since November. She had chosen it, and she had been right to choose it, and it had served her. But there was a difference between choosing solitude and having company removed, and she was sitting on the boundary of that difference in the dark, listening to a man breathe steadily beside her, and the boundary was not where she had thought it was. At 4 in the morning, someone knocked on the cave entrance. Not the wind. A knock. 3 distinct impacts against the cottonwood, planking the sound of a fist rather than a gust. Eleanor stood. She went to the entrance, unlatched the door Owen had built with iron hinges she now saw the full value of, and found Patrick Hale on the threshold, ice-covered and barely standing, a freight hauler who had been caught between Utica and the formations with no shelter and nothing left but the instinct to keep moving toward where he had heard warmth was. She brought him in. She sat him by the stones. She gave him broth. When he could speak, he told her what he had heard in Utica before the storm hit. Gerald Marsh had arrived 2 days earlier with a lawyer from Fort Benton. He was staying at the Finch house. He had papers. He was waiting for the storm to pass. Eleanor listened to all of it without changing expression. Then she went to the flour sack that had been sitting in the corner of the rear chamber since November 14th, and she took out the folded copy of her list. She held it for a moment in the firelight, $410 of documented labor, written in careful ink on paper that had survived 2 months in a cave and was about to survive considerably more. "Tell me everything else," he said, she told Patrick Hale. "Every word you remember." Outside, the storm continued. Inside, Eleanor Marsh sat with a piece of paper in her hand and the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a particular conversation and has been ready for it longer than the other party knows. Patrick Hale remembered everything. He was that kind of man Eleanor discovered over the next hour, the kind whose memory sharpened rather than blurred under pressure, who stored details not because he intended to use them, but because his mind simply refused to release anything it had taken in. He sat by the fire pit stones with both hands wrapped around a tin cup and told her in order every word Gerald Marsh had said in the Finch parlor the evening before the storm hit. The debt was real in the technical sense. Thomas Marsh had borrowed $40 from Gerald in 1871 to cover a supply shortfall when the first winter's trapping produced less than anticipated. There was a written note witnessed by a man in Fort Benton who was still alive and willing to testify. Under territorial law, a widow inherited her husband's outstanding obligations. Gerald had a lawyer named Alderton who had traveled from Fort Benton specifically for this purpose and who had, according to Hale, the professionally expressionless face of a man paid to win on paper rather than on merit. Gerald wanted the eastern quarter of the survey parcel Thomas had registered jointly with him before his death. Signing it over would satisfy the debt and all associated interest. If Eleanor refused, Alderton would file in the territorial court, and the process would take months and cost money she did not have. Hale paused. He looked at the paper she was holding. He also said something else. Before the storm in the saloon, Big Tom Calloway was there. Eleanor waited. "Gerald said you'd never last the winter, that you were living on stubbornness and it would run out before the cold did." Hale looked at his cup. Big Tom told him that the cave was on open territorial land that nobody had filed on, that you couldn't be removed from it legally, that Gerald had probably wasted the trip. A pause. Gerald didn't say anything after that. He just paid for his drink and left. Eleanor folded the paper along its original creases and held it in her lap. Owen was awake. She had not heard him stir, but she could tell by the quality of his stillness that he had been listening for some time. He was lying in the rear chamber with his bandaged hands resting on the blanket, his eyes open, watching her with the focused attention of someone who has recently survived something and is now assessing what comes next with considerable interest. She looked at him. He looked at the paper. "What's on it?" he asked. "Arithmetic," she said. The storm lasted 3 more days. Not 3 days of heavy snowfall, which would have been manageable, but 3 days of sustained Arctic air, moving down from the north with the focused patience of something that had started in the Canadian interior and intended to finish in Montana. The temperature did not rise above 0 until February 1st. On the worst night, the second night, it reached 49 below. The cave held. It did more than hold. As the hours accumulated and the cold outside approached the kind of intensity that stopped being weather and started being a test of materials, the cave simply continued to do what it had been doing since November: absorb or retain, release. The stones in the fire pit gave back their stored warmth in the measured way they always had. The sandstone walls maintained their temperature with the indifference of geology to human timelines. The front chamber stayed at 38 degrees. The rear chamber, with 6 people generating warmth, climbed to 51. They were not alone for long. The Chen family arrived before dawn on the first full day of the storm, Daniel leading them with the confidence of a 12-year-old who had walked this route enough times to know it without light. His father carried his youngest daughter on his back. His mother carried what they had managed to grab before the cabin wall began to crack inward from wind pressure. Daniel brought them straight to the rear chamber and then turned around and went back to the entrance to help Eleanor hang additional canvas against the wind that was finding the edges of Owen's doorframe. Big Tom Calloway arrived at first light alone, stamping snow from his boots in the entrance, looking around at what he found with the expression of a man recalculating something he had held as settled. He had come from half a mile away through zero visibility, following a route he had apparently committed to memory sometime in the past year without ever announcing that he had done so. He did not say anything about December when he had come with skepticism and gone with silence. He found a corner and sat down and became immediately useful, which was his way of handling most things. Reverend Holt came alone in the early afternoon of the first day walking because his horse had refused to leave the barn. He arrived coated in ice from the waist down, unable to speak for several minutes, sitting on the floor near the fire pit with his eyes closed and his breathing gradually returning to something regular. When he could speak, the first thing he said was her name, not Mrs. Marsh. Eleanor, as if the formality had been stripped away along with his certainty about several other things. Margaret Sutton came last. She arrived at the cave entrance near the end of the first day alone on foot, having left her horse at the Finch barn a quarter-mile back when the animal's footing became unreliable. She stood in the entrance and looked inside at 14 people arranged in various states of exhausted practicality at the fire pit stones and the organized food supply, and the horses standing calmly in the front chamber at Daniel Chen, teaching his little sister to count in English, in the corner at Owen Bergstrom, frostbitten hands, and all methodically dividing the food stores into portions, with the fairness of a man who understands that equity in small things prevents large problems. Eleanor stood at the entrance. She did not say, "I told you." She did not say anything that referenced any previous conversation. She said, "Come in, Mrs. Sutton." And Margaret Sutton, who had come 3 miles through a blizzard alone because the alternative was to stay in a house by herself, came in. 6 days. That was how long the storm held them. The death toll across Montana Territory calculated afterward, when the roads opened and people could travel again to find what the cold had done, came to 214. 2 families in Utica alone, a rider found frozen in his saddle on the Fort Benton Road. Livestock counted in the thousands. The winter of 1875 would be the reference point for every subsequent winter, for 50 years the measuring stick against which all other cold was assessed. In the cave, nobody died. The food stretched because Eleanor had been maintaining extra stores since October, after she noticed in September that the summer had been shorter than the summer before. The water came from melting snow in the entrance, a task that rotated through the group with a schedule Daniel proposed, and everyone accepted because he was 12 years old and therefore free of the social hesitations that would have made adults argue about it. The warmth came from the stones and from 14 bodies in an enclosed space, and from the fact that Eleanor had built something in November that was still doing exactly what she had built it to do. On the 3rd day, Margaret Sutton sat down beside Eleanor near the entrance, where Eleanor was monitoring the wind direction through a gap in the canvas covering. They sat without speaking for a while. Outside, the wind moved a bank of snow from one place to another with a sound like distant machinery. "How long have you been planning this?" Margaret asked. Eleanor considered the question genuinely. "The cave I started planning in April," she said, "when I saw the formations during a water haul and recognized what they were. And the rest of it?" Eleanor thought about the list in the flour sack, about the copies she had made before leaving, about the way she had documented every task, every date, every hour for 18 months before Gerald Marsh gave her a reason to use it. "I was paying attention," she said. "That's all it was." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words came out evenly without self-flagellation, in the tone of a woman who had decided something and was executing the decision. "More than one. I came to your cave in November to manage a problem I had decided you were. I was wrong about what you were." Eleanor looked at her. Margaret Sutton was not a bad person. Eleanor had understood this for some time. She was a person who organized her world according to categories that had served her well enough until they met something that did not fit them. And the storm had been, among other things, a demonstration of what the world does to categories that are held too rigidly. "You came in when I opened the door," Eleanor said. "That's enough." On the 6th day, the wind stopped. It did not taper. It simply ceased the way certain arguments end without transition, leaving behind a silence that was so complete and so sudden that everyone in the cave went still for a moment and listened to make sure it was real. The temperature outside had risen to 10 below zero. After what the past 6 days had been, this felt, as Big Tom Calloway said while looking at the thermometer Eleanor had nailed to the entrance post in December, like something close to a gift. They went out and looked at what the storm had left. Snow drifted into walls 10 feet high against the rock faces to the north. The ground between the formations was scoured bare in places, frozen earth exposed like something the winter had uncovered rather than covered. The landscape looked rearranged, as if the storm had reached down and shuffled it like cards, and then set it back without regard for where things had been before. Eleanor's cabin, visible from the top of the formation ridge, was standing. Every window blown out, the door hanging at an angle from one hinge. But the walls were upright and the roof was on, and that was more than could be said for what she found when she descended with Owen beside her, moving carefully on the ice slope. The Johnson place had lost its entire roof. The structure was open to the sky, the interior filled with drifted snow to the level of the windowsills. The Chen cabin had one wall pushed inward, the family's winter stores buried under the collapse. Of the 14 people who had sheltered in the Cave 11 had no home they could walk back into and resume living. Owen looked at the damage with the calculating eye of a carpenter estimating what repair required. And then he looked at Eleanor and she looked at him, and what passed between them was the wordless agreement of two people who have survived something together and understand that the next thing has already begun. Gerald Marsh came on a Tuesday, 11 days after the storm cleared. He arrived with Alderton the lawyer and with Reverend Holt, whom he had recruited as witness, without asking whether Holt was still inclined to serve in that capacity. The three of them rode up the slope to the cave in the late morning under a sky that had turned the clear, hard blue that Montana produces after serious weather, as if the atmosphere were compensating. Eleanor was inside. Owen was repairing the window frames of the cabin 200 yards away, visible from the cave entrance, close enough that she could hear the hammer if she listened. She had told him she would handle this herself. He had looked at her for a moment and then gone back to his measurement. That was the right response, and she had noted it. Gerald looked around the cave entrance and then inside. He saw the organization, the sleeping platforms, the stone fire pit with its careful architecture, the table and chairs Owen had made from milled lumber, the flour sack hung on a peg on the wall. He saw a place that had been lived in through a serious winter and was still functioning. Whatever he had expected to find, this was not it, and the adjustment took him a visible moment. Alderton read the claim without preamble. $40 principal, $8.40 interest accrued since 1871. Thomas Marsh, deceased, obligated by written instrument. Eleanor Marsh, widow, liable as successor. The eastern quarter parcel, surveyed and registered, sufficient to satisfy the debt in full. Sign here. Gerald watched her across the table while Alderton read. He was looking for the thing he had been looking for since November, the thing he had looked for in the doorway when she left the property with her flour sack. He was looking for the moment when she would realize the limits of her position. Eleanor waited until Alderton finished. Then she went to the flour sack on the wall peg and took out the folded paper she had carried since the 14th of November. She set it on the table and smoothed it flat. She read from it not because she needed to, but because reading it aloud made the numbers real in a way that hearing them did not. Dates, tasks, hours, rates. Fence repair, 3 occasions. Cabin wall construction, the north and east faces. Root cellar excavation. Garden preparation, planting and harvest for 2 seasons. Furniture construction. Equipment maintenance and repair. The list went on for 26 lines. At the bottom, the total. $410. Thomas owed you $40, Gerald, she said. She kept her voice level because she had no need to perform anger and had never confused performance with strength. You owe me $410. I've been waiting 2 years for the opportunity to have this conversation. Alderton looked at the paper with the expression of a lawyer encountering a document he should have anticipated and did not. He picked it up, read it again. He set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who has just recalculated the trajectory of a proceeding. These are valid labor claims, he said, and he was speaking to Gerald, not to Eleanor. Documented, dated, the rate is consistent with territorial standards. He paused. If she files a counterclaim, the Eastern Quarter doesn't cover it. Not at these numbers. Gerald looked at his lawyer. He looked at the paper. He looked at Eleanor. She met his gaze without moving. She had been waiting for this look for 2 years, and she had nothing to add to it. He would either recognize what he was seeing, or he would not, and either way the arithmetic did not change. He turned to look at Reverend Holt. Holt was standing near the entrance with his hands clasped in front of him and an expression that had moved some distance from the one he had arrived with. He had been in this cave 4 times now. He had sheltered here during the worst storm in Montana history. He had watched Eleanor Marsh manage 14 people and 6 days of crisis with the same steady competence she brought to everything else. He was not the same man who had come in December to rescue her from her own decisions. I can't advise you on the legal question, Holt said to Gerald, but I can tell you what I've seen. He looked at the cave, at the fire pit, at the table with the paper on it. This woman built something that saved 11 lives during that storm, possibly more counting the riders she sheltered before January. He looked back at Gerald. Whatever you came here to accomplish, I'd think carefully about the company you want to keep going forward. Gerald Marsh picked up his copy of the claim document. He folded it. He put it in his coat pocket. He did not sign anything. He did not say anything further. He walked out of the cave and down the slope to his horse and rode east toward Utica, and Alderton followed him, and that was the last time Eleanor Marsh ever saw her brother-in-law face to face. Holt stayed. He sat down in one of the chairs Owen had made and looked at the table for a while. I owe you several apologies, Mrs. Marsh, he said. I came here in December to save you. I've spent the past 2 months discovering that you were the one doing the saving. He paused. I should have seen it sooner. Come back in spring, Reverend, she said. I'll be here. I know, he said, and he said it with the certainty of a man who has updated his information and trusts the new version. Owen Bergstrom proposed marriage on a morning in late February when the temperature had finally climbed above zero for 3 consecutive days, and the idea of spring still distant had become possible to think about without it feeling like cruelty. He did not ask her inside the cave. He waited until they were standing outside in the cold morning air, both of them looking at the cabin he had been rebuilding for the past 3 weeks. The windows reglazed the door, rehung the north wall reinforced with packed earth that would stay there until someone removed it deliberately. He had rebuilt it using every principle she had demonstrated, and the result was something that looked like a cabin from the outside and functioned in all the ways that mattered, like the inside of a mountain. I have land and farming knowledge, he said. You have engineering sense, I don't. Separately, we're each missing half of what this territory needs. He looked at the cabin. Also, I haven't left since December, which I think says something. She almost smiled. Is this a proposal, Owen? It's a partnership offer, he said. That too. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the rock formation behind her. She asked the question she needed the answer to. If I say yes, does the cave stay mine? He looked at her with the direct gaze she had come to recognize as his version of honesty. It was always yours, he said. She said yes. That evening, after Owen had gone back to finish the window trim, before the light went, Eleanor sat alone in the cave for what she understood might be one of the last evenings she would spend there, in the same way she had spent the winter. She was not melancholy about it. It was simply a threshold, and she had crossed enough thresholds to recognize them without drama. She was sitting with the fire pit stones at her back, warm through her coat, when Daniel brought a package to the entrance. Someone had left it with his mother in Utica, he said. No name on the outside. Inside was a wool scarf, dark blue, the count made on a European loom. Eleanor recognized it before she had consciously processed what she was looking at, because some things bypass recognition and arrive already known. It had belonged to their mother. Clara had kept it after the crossing. There was a piece of paper inside the fold. The handwriting was her sister's in the Polish they had both learned before English, in the careful script of someone who had thought for a long time about how much to say. I knew I should have said so. Just that, one line. No signature, though none was needed. Eleanor sat with the scarf in her hands for a long time. She did not try to construct what Clara's silence had cost her sister or what the writing of this note had required. She knew those calculations because she had lived alongside Clara for 38 years and understood the precise weight of what her sister carried. The note was not an explanation. It was not a reconciliation. It was a woman in an impossible position, finding the smallest honest thing she could do, and doing it, and Eleanor received it for exactly what it was. She folded the scarf carefully. She placed it in the flour sack that had carried everything she owned on November 14th, the same flour sack that now held the copy of her list, the pencil map she had drawn in April, and the piece of birch bark on which Daniel had written his first full sentence in proper English back in December. She hung the sack on its peg on the wall. She did not write back. There was nothing to write that the scarf had not already received. They were married on April 3rd, 1874 by Reverend Holt, in a ceremony that 47 people attended, including Robert Finch and Margaret Sutton, who arrived together and sat near the front and did not appear to find this remarkable. Big Tom Calloway stood at the back and managed to look simultaneously uncomfortable and pleased in the way of large men at small ceremonies. Daniel Chen stood with his family and spent most of the ceremony watching Reverend Holt with the focused attention of a boy deciding what he thinks of a man who has changed his mind publicly and without complaint. The community gave them lumber, not as charity as a specific material acknowledgement that what Eleanor had built through that winter had value the community was prepared to recognize in practical terms. The winter of 1875 arrived on October 29th and did not intend to leave quickly. Eleanor had been watching the signs since August, the early departure of certain birds, the thickness of the fur on the animals she and Owen trapped in September, the quality of the light in October that was different in some way she could not have articulated, but recognized as a warning from the same part of her that had read the barometric drop in January 1874. She told Owen in September that they needed twice the firewood they had planned. He looked at her for a moment, then doubled the order. By November 12th, the temperature was below zero and staying. By December, they were burning wood at a rate that would have been unsustainable if they had not prepared. The cabin held steady at 51 degrees, adequate. They dressed in layers indoors. They kept working. January 17th, 1875, 52 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. Not wind chill. Actual air temperature read off the thermometer on the cabin wall, then verified against the thermometer Owen had nailed outside, then accepted as real with the quiet resignation of people confronting a number that exceeds previous experience. Cottonwood trees along the creek split from the inside as their moisture froze and expanded, each one producing a sound like a rifle shot in the pre-dawn darkness. Smoke from the cabin stove fell rather than rose because the air above the chimney was colder than the exhaust coming out. The world had reached a temperature at which ordinary physical behavior stopped being reliable. The cabin held that day and the next and the next. They burned wood constantly, fed the fire every 3 hours through the night in shifts, and the walls kept the cold at bay through a combination of Owen's construction and Eleanor's design principles working together the way the partnership had been working for a year. They got through January 17th and the 18th and the 19th. On January 20th, the temperature rose to 35 below. It felt genuinely and without irony like relief. They let themselves rest. They should not have. January 22nd, the wind came. Not cold alone, which the cabin had been managing. Wind sustained at 61 miles per hour from the north, 16 hours without break. The kind of force that does not look for weaknesses so much as reveal them. The double wall system, which had provided excellent insulation against static cold, turned against them when wind pressure found the air gap and converted it from trapped warmth to channeled draft. The temperature inside began to fall at 2 degrees per hour. By midnight, it was 29 degrees inside the cabin. Owen was burning wood at a pace that would exhaust their supply in 6 days. The door was shaking in its frame hard enough that Eleanor could see the candlelight flicker with each gust. She looked at Owen. He was already looking at her. They had 148 seconds to dress in every layer they owned, collect what they could carry in 2 minutes, and get out before the temperature made movement dangerous. She knew this the way she knew the cave was 200 yards away, and the wind made it functionally invisible. And she had walked the road enough times to know it in her body regardless of what her eyes could or could not see. Now, she said, before we're too cold to move. Owen did not argue. He was already pulling on his second coat. 200 yards. Zero visibility, not from snowfall, but from ground drift, frozen crystals moving horizontally at 61 miles per hour, a surface that stripped exposed skin in under 2 minutes. Eleanor had the rope. She had brought it from the cabin specifically for this possibility coiled over her shoulder because she had been thinking about this walk since October. She tied one end to Owen's belt. She held the other in her left hand. With her right, she held Daniel's hand, and Daniel held his father, and his father held his mother, and his mother held the baby because the Chen family had been in the cave since the temperature dropped and had come to the cabin for dinner, and the storm had closed the option of going back before they finished eating. Owen led, Eleanor counted behind him. The wind hit them like a wall the moment they cleared the cabin door, and for the first 3 steps, she felt her body register the cold as something close to a physical blow. Then the counting started, and there was only the counting. At step 100, she could not see Owen ahead of her despite the rope. At 150, she felt Daniel's grip tighten in her right hand and tighten back. At 220, Owen stopped. She moved up beside him. He had turned his head toward her, his face encased in the ice, his breath had formed in the first 100 yards. He did not know where they were. The white in every direction was identical in total. She had both their counts in her head. She had been counting his footstep length for a year in every terrain and every condition. She knew the difference between his stride on flat ground and his stride on the uphill approach to the formation. They were trending slightly south. The rock face was 15 steps to the right. She pulled his arm. He went with her. At step 237, his hand hit stone. She heard him exhale a long, controlled release, and in the sound of it, she heard everything the past year had built between them, all the decisions and corrections and apologies and mournings, in the particular quality of trust that develops between people who have been tested and found each other reliable. He found the door and opened it, and they went in. 14 people sheltered in the cave that first night. By dawn, the number was 15 when Big Tom Calloway arrived at first light, and by the end of the second day, it was 16 when Patrick Hale arrived again, becoming a man who would spend the rest of his life telling people that if they were caught between settlements in a storm, the Marsh shelter was 3 miles west of the old survey stake, and it would hold. Big Tom Calloway arrived on the morning of the second day and directed 2 more people to the cave before coming in himself, standing at the entrance and telling them precisely where it was and precisely how to navigate to it through the drift using landmarks he had memorized sometime in the past year, without, as far as Eleanor knew, ever discussing the fact that he had done so. Margaret Sutton did not arrive this time because she was in Helena visiting her sister. What arrived instead was her husband Robert Finch, who had been in Utica when the storm hit and made it to the cave on foot in the first hour, and who sat for 6 days watching 16 people share space and food and firewood, according to a system that was simple and fair and generated no serious conflict, and who was, by the time the wind stopped, a different kind of convert than the dramatic ones, a quiet one already planning. The storm held for 6 days. The temperature outside ranged from 31 below to 49 below. In the cave, the temperature held between 45 and 51 degrees. Outside, 214 people died across Montana territory. Inside the cave on the 6th day, Daniel Chen turned 13 years old. Eleanor had remembered the date. She had set aside a portion of flour and made a small flat bread on the heated stones, and Daniel ate it with the expression of someone receiving exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment, which is one of the rarest experiences available to human beings and one of the most worth providing. Spring came the way it always came after serious winters, late cautious, and then all at once. Robert Finch organized the community contribution. Lumber, labor, iron, hardware donated by the Fort Benton blacksmith. William Drake came back from his railroad survey camp and drew up formal plans documenting the cave's design, the fire pit architecture, the ventilation geometry, the sleeping platform dimensions. He submitted them to the territorial government with a proposal for similar shelters at strategic points along major routes. The government filed them and did nothing, which was what governments generally did with good ideas submitted before the bureaucracy was ready to receive them. But Drake sent copies to 7 other settlements himself, and those copies were acted on by people who had heard what happened in the Judith Basin during the winter of 1875 and did not need a government directive to understand the value of preparation. By the following winter, 7 cave shelters existed across Montana territory, each one built by settlers who had adapted the design for their local geology, their available materials, their specific conditions. None of them were identical to Eleanor's. All of them worked on the same principle. Big Tom Calloway, who had come to the cave in November 1873 to warn Eleanor that rock didn't breathe, became its most reliable advocate. He told every freight hauler and every rider who passed through his section of territory that the Marsh shelter was 3 miles west of the old survey stake, that it was the warmest structure between Fort Benton and Helena, and that he would stand behind that claim against anyone who disagreed. He did not explain the transition between his first position and his second one. Some evolutions are better demonstrated than explained. Eleanor kept the cave. She used it as a cold storage through the summers, the 45-degree interior preserving root vegetables months longer than any conventional cellar. She used it as a classroom on summer afternoons when the cave was cooler than any building on the surface, teaching reading and arithmetic to whoever came, Daniel first and then others, until the informal arrangement had enough students that Reverend Holt proposed formalizing it, which led to a conversation about a proper schoolhouse that took 3 years to complete but eventually produced one. She used it as a storm shelter whenever the sky turned that particular shade of yellow-gray that she had learned to read before her conscious mind could name what it was seeing. And she kept it for the reason she had always kept it, the reason she could not have explained entirely to anyone who had not lived the winter of 1873 in her specific position. The cave was on open territorial land. No one had filed on it. No one could put their name on paper and claim it away from her. It existed outside the system of documentation that Gerald Marsh had tried to use against her, outside the social architecture that Margaret Sutton had tried to enforce, outside every framework that required someone else's permission to be valid. It was simply there, and she had simply understood it. And that understanding was hers in a way that could not be transferred or taken or disputed by any instrument a lawyer from Fort Benton could produce. April 19, 03. Eleanor Marsh was 71 years old. Owen had died the previous autumn, a quiet death at the end of a full season, the way he had done most things without drama, having ensured that everything requiring attention had been attended to before he let go. She missed him with the specific quality of grief that comes from losing someone who was genuinely useful to you in every sense of that word, someone whose presence had made possible things that absence now made harder. And she had found that the best response was to keep doing the things he had helped her learn to do, which was also what he would have recommended. She walked the 3 miles to the cave on an April morning that was cold but not viciously so, accompanied by her 2 grandchildren, James, who was 10 and already had his grandfather's carpenter's eye, and Ruth, who was 8 and had something else entirely. Something Eleanor had been watching develop for the past 3 years, with the quiet attention she brought to things she recognized but could not yet name. The cave was unchanged in the ways that mattered. The sleeping platforms had long since rotted and been removed. The fire pit was cold, but the walls were the walls, and the stone was the stone. And when Eleanor stepped inside and felt the still air at 47 degrees, the same temperature it had been on the first night, she felt something that was not quite memory and not quite the present, but some combination of both that only very old places can produce in people who have known them for a very long time. James went immediately to the fire pit and began examining the chimney construction with professional interest. He would be a builder. She had known this for years. Ruth walked to the rear wall and placed her palm flat against the stone. She stood there for a moment, feeling what the rock offered, which was the same thing it had always offered: steadiness. Was it scary, Ruth asked, living here alone? Eleanor stood in the middle of the cave and considered this honestly. She remembered the first night, the coyotes, the 23 degrees outside and the 47 inside, and the decision she had made, not with fear, but with the particular clarity that comes when you have been paying attention long enough to understand what you are seeing. No, she said, it was the least scary place I had ever been, because I built it to last. Ruth kept her hand on the rock. She was thinking. Eleanor could see it the way she could always see it in this child, a slow and thorough processing, the kind that arrived at conclusions other people reached by accident, if they reached them at all. Can I come here alone sometimes? Ruth asked. To think. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter's hand on the wall. 8 years old, standing in the place where Eleanor had spent the most formative winter of her life, asking the question that Eleanor had never articulated, but had answered through every subsequent decade of her existence. The cave was not just a shelter. It had never been only that. It was a place where the noise of other people's expectations could not reach, where the stone held its temperature against all external pressure, where a person could hear their own thinking without competition. It was a place that required nothing of you except the willingness to understand it. The thing Eleanor had built in November of 1873 was not walls and a fire pit. It was the proof that looking carefully at what already exists is sometimes the most radical act available to a person. That working with what is there rather than fighting what is not there produces results that last. That the most enduring structures are the ones that do not resist the world, but simply understand it. She had tried to teach this to everyone who had come through the cave. She had tried to teach it to Daniel and to Owen and to Reverend Holt, and in her way even to Margaret Sutton, who had learned it reluctantly and in her own time, but had learned it. She had tried to teach it to 4 children and 3 grandchildren in the cabin and in the classroom that had eventually been built, because enough people understood that the teaching was worth making permanent. Now she stood in the cave and looked at Ruth's hand on the wall, and she understood that the teaching, this particular lesson, was already complete. Ruth had already arrived at the question that was the answer. Yes, Eleanor said, come back whenever you need to. Ruth nodded once with the nod of a person making a promise rather than accepting an offer. She took her hand from the wall and turned around and looked at the cave with the assessing property-taking gaze that Eleanor recognized from a long time ago, from a woman standing at a rock face at dusk in November, with everything she owned in a flour sack, measuring depth and ceiling height and floor slope, and understanding what she was looking at. The genes for it apparently had not thinned. They walked back the 3 miles in the April cold. James talking about the chimney construction and what improvements he might make if it were his Ruth, saying nothing but keeping pace, and Eleanor listening to both of them and to the landscape around them, and feeling in the particular quality of that morning something she could only call complete. Not finished. Complete. The way a thing is complete when it has done what it was built to do and is still standing. The cave remained functional through the 1910s. Archaeologists who documented it in 1967 found the original fire pit intact, the sandstone still showing the heat marks from a burning that had first been made in November of 1873. Carbon dating confirmed continuous use from that year through approximately 1918. They noted the elegant simplicity of the ventilation design. They noted that the thermal stability of the interior remained consistent with Eleanor Marsh's recorded observations from the winter of her first season. They wrote a paper about it, and the paper was read by engineers working on passive solar design, and those engineers incorporated the principles into buildings that would be constructed in cities Eleanor Marsh had never seen, for purposes she could not have imagined, by people who would never know her name. But the principle was the same. Earth holds temperature steady when the air goes wild. The rock does not care what the weather is doing. The most enduring shelter is the one that was already there before you arrived, waiting for someone patient enough to recognize it and practical enough to make it their own. Eleanor Marsh had been that person. In the autumn of 1873, with nothing but a flour sack and 41 years of paying attention, she had walked into the side of a mountain and made it into a home. It held